Alright guys, something super cool just happened. One of my favorite artists, creators, channels, Dan of Danocracy, reached out to me last week to see if I wanted to do a collab with him. And it went something like this. He was like, "Hey man, I got this fun idea for my next video and I wanted to see if you had any interest in doing a collab." To which I replied something like, "Absolutely, sign me up. I don't care what it is. I'm in 100%. Let's do this." And he was like, "Awesome. So I'm going to make some royal chicken nuggets that look like gems, and I need a box to display them in. And I was thinking that one out of leather would be like a Middle Ages vibe." And I was like, "So like a chicken nuggets box, but made out of leather." And he was like, "Exactly." So off I went to McDonald's because obviously I needed to do some research. And then I got to work figuring out how to make a leather chicken nugget box. You know, like any typical Saturday. The box is held together with overlapping flaps on the inside. But I think instead of doing it that way, I'm going to carefully cut the seams to make the template, and then use the corset stitch to stitch the seams back together. I feel like watching me cut seams is boring, so instead let's just... To avoid getting the leather all greasy, I decided to transfer the shape onto some cardstock. I simply traced the shape and then used some scissors and my trusty X-Acto to cut the shape out. Now that we have the template, let's move on to the actual leather. We decided the royal nugget box needed a little bit more royalty, so we decided to laser some designs onto the leather. I added some low tack tape to the top of the leather and then traced out the areas to be lasered to help ensure the images were aligned correctly. Then I just let the laser do its thing. We landed on "Thy Nuggets" for the front flap, and then I added a nice border and an AI-generated McDonald's royal crest on top. Even with the tape, I got a lot more burnout around the engravings than usual, and I think it's because I used unfinished leather. But I decided to roll the dice and hope that the leather conditioner and the dye help get rid of it. With the images engraved, it was now time to trace the shape onto the leather using my scratch awl. Then I loaded up my trusty X-Acto with a fresh blade and got to work cutting out the shape. I always try to cut away from the piece to help avoid slipping and cutting into it. With the shape cut out, it was time to score some stitch lines on the seams that I'll be stitching together later. When punching the stitching holes, I made sure to punch the exact same number of holes on each side of the seam. Before applying dye, I always use some neat's foot oil to condition the leather, which helps it from drying out. You simply wipe some across the whole thing and then let it dry to the touch. I did some testing off camera to see if the dye was the color I was going for, and it ended up being too dark. So I decided to dilute the dye with water. I ended up with 2 parts water to 1 part dye. Once I had the dye mixed up, I simply used a dauber to apply it to the leather, applying it in both directions. Once it dried, it was stitching time. I decided to use the corset stitch, both because it's the right stitch for stitching seams like this, but also because it adds to that Middle Ages vibe. I made a video dedicated to leather stitching where I go in depth into the process of how to do this corset stitch and others, and I'll leave a link above in case you want to check it out. But at a high level, I start with 2 needles secured to opposite ends of the same thread. Then I take the left needle and stitch down into the next hole on the right, and then back up through the hole parallel to that one on the left side. That creates 1/2 of the cross. Then I do the same thing with the right needle, only opposite. Down through the hole on the left side and then back up through the parallel hole on the right side, completing the cross. Then I just continue that pattern all the way down, making sure to pull it tight after each cross. With all the stitching done, the only thing left was to add a bottom piece of leather on the inside to make it look a little bit more finished and to give it a little bit more structure. And with that, we have a custom leather nugget box fit for a king. Nugget. I want to give a big shout out to my crew of patrons over on Patreon that make these videos possible. They're an amazing group of super supportive people who I can't thank enough. And if you're interested in supporting my content too, while also getting some great rewards at the same time, please consider joining my Unnecessary Leather League of supporters over on Patreon. I've left a link in the description if you're interested and able to support my channel. Huge shout out to Dan for coming to me with this super fun project. It was truly an honor. And if you want to see Thy Royal Nuggets, check out his video here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.